Great, I think we'll get started. First, I want to start by thanking you all for joining us this evening. I'm Marc Tessier-Lavigne. I'm the president of Stanford University, and I'm honored to welcome you to the first of two Tanner Lectures on Human Values, and to introduce this year's lecturer, Professor Richard Kraut. Professor Kraut is the Charles and Emma Morrison Professor in the Humanities at Northwestern University, and tonight he'll be speaking about the richness of human experience. His talk will be followed by a discussion seminar tomorrow morning featuring participation from the University of Toronto Classics and Philosophy Professor Rachel Barney and from University of Toronto Philosophy Professor Tom Herka. Professor Kraut will give his second Tanner lecture tomorrow evening on virtue and experience. And the discussion seminar for that lecture will take place on Friday morning and feature participation from Yale philosophy professor Stephen Darwall and philosopher and author Rebecca Neuberger-Goldstein, whom I had the pleasure of hosting back in 2015 when I was still at Rockefeller University. So I encourage you all to attend each of these extraordinary opportunities. I want to thank everyone at the McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society and in Stanford's Department of Philosophy for putting together this year's exceptional program. And thank you so much again to Professor Kraut for joining us at Stanford this year and to each of the discussion seminar participants as well. Stanford's proud to be one of the 9 distinguished universities to host the Tanner Lectures. The other host universities are Cambridge, Harvard, Michigan, Oxford, Princeton, UC Berkeley, Utah, and Yale. The lectures, the Tanner Lectures, were established by the late American scholar, entrepreneur, and philanthropist, Obert Clark Tanner. His life has been described as a juggling act of 2 passions, education and business. He earned his undergraduate, Bachelor of Laws, and JD degrees at the University of Utah, and then went on to study philosophy at Harvard and at Stanford. Here he earned his master's degree and then was appointed to our faculty. He taught religious studies at Stanford from 1939 to 1944 and served as acting chaplain. He was later appointed a professor of philosophy at the University of Utah, where, legend has it, he taught each morning for 29 years straight. Now, in addition to his education and work as a scholar, he founded the Tanner Company, which became one of the largest manufacturers and retailers of employee recognition awards, which I think we can all agree is something we can all feel good about. Now, Tanner and his wife, Grace, were deeply concerned about peace and the public good. They were passionate about the arts and humanities, but also about science. In fact, Grace had a particular love for biology and anthropology. They established this lecture series as an opportunity for scholars and broader communities to, quote, search for a better understanding of human behavior and human values. They sought to do so for 2 reasons: for the intrinsic value of deeper understanding, but also for the eventual benefit of applying that understanding to improve our own and other people's lives. Stanford is a natural home for the Tanner lectures, given the spirit of our founders and the mission of Stanford. Of course, at Stanford, we pursue excellence, but we don't do it just for the sake of excellence. We pursue excellence to benefit humanity. Now, appointment as a Tanner lecturer recognizes uncommon achievement and outstanding abilities in the field of human values. Our Tanner lecturer this year, Professor Richard Kraut, is an ideal choice. He earned his undergraduate degree in philosophy at the University of Michigan and his PhD in philosophy as well at Princeton. He is the author of 2 acclaimed works, Against Absolute Goodness and What is Good and Why? The Ethics of Well-Being. His scholarship on goodness, beauty, contemporary moral and political philosophy, as well as the ethics and political thought of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, has led to him being referred to as, quote, one of our most respected analytical philosophers. And accolades that have used to describe his work include substantially original, impressively detailed, persuasive, and quite revolutionary. One scholar's review of his most recent book stated, with its lucid prose, rare in a philosophy book, it can be read in one sitting. Indeed, Professor Kraut is known for making the most complex and at times intricate, language of philosophy both compelling and accessible. His work has been widely recognized. He's received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Center for Hellenic Studies. And he's also received Oxford University's Star Fellowship of Lady Margaret Hall. And he is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences as well. So we're thrilled to welcome Professor Kraut this evening to offer a lecture on the richness of human experience. Professor Kraut, thank you so much for being here with us at Stanford. We're delighted by your presence and so look forward to your contributions tonight and also in the days to come. So would everyone please join me in welcoming Professor Richard Kraut.
Thank you very much for that too flattering introduction. I'm greatly honored to have been invited to deliver these lectures, and I'm greatly looking forward to questions from my commentators and from everyone in the audience. In these lectures, and I should say, in the handout I've divided the paper. You'll see the division of the paper into sections, so I'll try to keep you posted about where we are as I go along. So this first part is called Well-Being and Virtue. In these lectures, I will juxtapose ideas drawn from Plato and Aristotle and some conundrums of recent moral philosophy in the hope that they will shed light on each other. My topic is human well-being, and in particular, the connection between well-being and ethical virtue. One striking feature of ancient ethics is the general agreement of its major figures and schools that well-being, or what they call eudaimonia, our closest equivalent to well-being, well-being is available only to a good person. Can that thesis, or perhaps some weaker version of it, be sustained? In Plato's Republic, Socrates is challenged to assess the value of justice by giving a detailed account of what it is in itself when it is present with its own force in the soul of the person possessing it. And that is the first item on the handout. I will dwell a little bit on Plato and then move on to Aristotle. Our attention is thus turned away from the possible external rewards of just action to the inner life of the just individual. Socrates responds to the challenge by describing justice as a certain kind of internal harmony or order, a condition that obtains when the three parts of the soul do their job properly, cooperating rather than conflicting with the others. Here, he seems to be adverting to the felt quality of the life of a good person. Such an individual, he seems to be saying, feels at one with all he does, feels, and desires. The Hellenistic schools, Stoics, Epicureans, and Skeptics, similarly appeal to inner peace or tranquility when they commend the ethical life. They presuppose that there is something it is like to be a good person, a certain way that individual experiences the world, and it is that feature of the virtues that underlies the connection these philosophers make between well-being and virtue. Well, what of Aristotle? I would like to call attention to a subtle and compelling point he makes against the thesis that well-being consists in virtue. And that's the next item on the handout. What he proposes is not an outright rejection of that thesis, but a modification of it. The passage I have in mind says, virtue cannot be eudaimonia, cannot be well-being, because a virtuous person might fall asleep for the entire duration of his life, and no one would think that an enviable state. Aristotle then offers this modification. Eudaimonia consists not in the state of virtue, but in virtuous activity. Well, it sounds like a good point, but what is the idea exactly? I suspect that many of us, many students of Aristotle, read into his words the obvious point that sleep contains little in the way of conscious experience, only the brief periods during which one dreams. For the most part, there is nothing it is like to be asleep. A virtuous person who slept away his life would have little in the way of conscious experience, and there would be little good in that. This way of understanding Aristotle's argument takes him to be saying, along with Plato and the Hellenistic philosophers, that the value of virtue lies in the way a good person experiences things, in the felt quality of his inner life as he interacts with his social world. Turning next to modern and contemporary moral philosophy, there is universal agreement that at least one component of well-being is the felt quality of experience. What is controversial is whether there are other components, possibly of greater value, that are not experiential. Often this question is treated as a debate about hedonism, the thesis that pleasure alone is good. Like many other philosophers, not all, I reject that monistic conception of well-being. Well-being, I believe, is composed of many goods. Even so, I think there is something right about hedonism, namely its restriction of well-being to features of our inner life, our introspectable felt experience. The conception of well-being I will defend might be called experientialism. It holds, and this is the next item on the handout, it holds that A, well-being is composed of many goods, but B, all of them are experiential, and C, pleasure is only one element of good experience. Okay, so next section, egoism rejected. Although I will sometimes borrow from Aristotle, I should guard against misunderstanding by pointing to one of his doctrines that I do not adopt. He is often taken to believe that all practical justification must be grounded in the well-being of the agent. One's ultimate goal on this reading is solely one's own good. Whether or not that is really his view, it is clear, I think, that he does defend a doctrine in the same vicinity, namely that a good person never acts in a way that diminishes his well-being. He never sacrifices to any degree his good for the sake of others. And here on the handout is the passage in which I think that this is what he is saying. I'll read it to you. It is true also of the good person that he does a great deal for his friends and his country, and will die for them if he must. He will sacrifice money, honors, and in general, the things for which people compete, procuring for himself what is noble, kalan. He would prefer a short period of intense pleasure to a long period of mild pleasure, a year of living nobly to many indifferent years, and a single noble and great action to many trivial ones. Presumably, this is what happens with those who die for others. It is indeed a great and noble thing that they choose for themselves. They will also sacrifice money on the condition that their friends gain more. While the friend gets money, he gets what is noble, and therefore assigns himself the greater good. In all praiseworthy actions, then, the good person is seen to assign himself the larger share of what is noble. As I read it, it entails that a virtuous person can and should adopt the following policy. I will never do anything for others that makes me the slightest bit worse off, on balance, than I would otherwise be. But that strikes me as a deeply problematic thesis. It is certainly far removed from our common sense conception of what an ethically virtuous person is like. If you were introduced to someone who told you that he has this policy of no self-sacrifice, you would certainly not seek him out as a friend or a colleague. You would not think that such a person would make a good parent. My thesis that it is good for someone to be a good person does not presuppose or entail that one should act only for one's own sake, or that one's ultimate goal should only be one's own good, or that one should never accept a lesser amount of well-being for the good of others. So although I think I'm borrowing some very important things from Aristotle, that's a part of his philosophy that I do not want to borrow. Okay, next section, oysters and experience machines. I said that I will juxtapose ideas drawn from Plato and Aristotle and some conundrums of recent moral philosophy. One puzzle is quite familiar, the other less so. The latter, the less familiar one, was raised by the British idealist philosopher J.M.E. McTaggart in The Nature of Existence. He asks us to compare two lives. The first he calls oyster-like because it has, in his words, very little consciousness and a very little excess of pleasure over pain. The second is that of a human being. His striking thesis is that a sufficiently longer oyster-like life is better than any shorter human life, no matter how wonderful the goods in the human life are. Let that human life be full of knowledge, virtue, love, pleasure, and whatever else makes for a good human life. McTaggart holds that the oyster-like life would more than compensate for the hour-by-hour poverty of its simple life by the greater quantity of time during which it possessed the simple, faint pleasures it enjoys, so long as its greater longevity is great enough. And what you have next on the handout, I wouldn't try to read it all right now. It's too long, but it's there for your interest and pleasure at some later point. I'll tell you all you need to know about this. He used some very large figures to make his point. 1 million years of a rich human life versus many more for the oyster-like creatures. The important contrast for him is that the human life has an endpoint far earlier than that of the oyster-like existence. The latter, the oyster, is stipulated to have a life longer by enough to attain eventual superiority. He adds that at some point it would have a life 1 million times better than that of the best human life. I will stay closer to our familiar world by assuming instead that the marvelous human life is about 85 or 90 years long, not 1 million. The other creature in this comparison will be called McTaggart's oyster. I will assume that it feels no pain and only the mildest pleasure. The term McTaggart's thesis will refer to the claim that his oyster eventually, after perhaps thousands of years, or however long it takes, will have more well-being than even the best of human lives of normal length. Our second puzzle was raised by Robert Nozick in Anarchy, State, and Utopia. He asks us to imagine an experience machine, a device that induces in a detached brain any illusory experience that the subject chooses. The principal claim of Nozick's discussion of this device is that we would not and should not choose to live in such a machine, whatever its surface or initial attractions. Inside the machine, we would be, he thinks, merely passive consumers of experience, cut off from the real world. it is better for us to live our lives, something no machine can do for us, and to be in contact with a reality beyond our own brains. And if you look on the second page of the handout, there's a little bit of Nozick's description of what he thinks is deficient about life inside the experience machine. Nozick's experience machine might be taken to show not only that there is much more to well-being than pleasure, but more generally that there is much more to it than its experiential component. The contrast between his view and mine is stark. For him, the experiential component of well-being is small. For me, it is everything. It may seem odd to bring together these two thought experiments of 20th century value theory. What have they to do with each other? And what have they to do with Plato and Aristotle? My reply is this. If we reject McTaggart's thesis, we must say what assumption leads him astray or what he fails to recognize. My diagnosis is that he fails to apply to his thought experiment the idea that a sufficient supply of peculiarly human goods is superior to any amount of the lower goods available to the oyster. That goods belong to different orders of value is a thesis that I think fits comfortably with the thinking of Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics. They hold, at least as I read them, that the experiential good of being a good human being belongs to a higher order than the good of the pleasures of nourishment available to an oyster. They assume that to give a convincing account of where the value of virtue lies, one must depict the inner life of a good person, what it is about such a person's thoughts, feelings, aspirations, pleasures, memories, and so on, that makes that individual's life appealing. So they could easily accept an experientialist conception of well-being, and I think would be right to do so. And that is why I discuss Nozick's experience machine. It is generally taken to reveal the minor importance of the experiential components of well-being. So next section, where does McTaggart go wrong? One might believe that McTaggart's thesis is correct, and so the problem of explaining where he goes wrong does not arise. But even if one had this conviction, there would still be some value in noticing what assumptions he needs to make or reject to arrive at this conclusion. I assume that you, like me, reject his thesis, but that is not what matters most here. The more important task is to take apart his reasoning, and if we reject it, to identify what the best alternative is. One possibility is this. Although we might attribute to an oyster the desire to eat now, it does not have a desire to eat tomorrow. Its mental life does not include a conception of itself as something that endures. McTaggart can reach his conclusion only if he keeps adding one day's pleasures to the next day's, and the next day's, and so on. But that aggregation is not something the oyster can perform or care about. So its life does not keep getting better with each passing day. Its well-being does not extend beyond the present moment. It has a good now and another good later, but not more good over time. But with human beings, it, of course, is different. So that's one possible way of saying where McTaggart goes wrong. A second possibility is this. The oyster's life does keep getting better for a while, but at a certain point, the good in its life has reached a limit. It continues to experience pleasure for however long it lives, thousands of years, but pleasure is no longer good for it after a few days or months or years, for by then it has reached the limits of its goodness. But the peculiarly human goods which are unavailable to an oyster retain their goodness for the full length of a normal human lifespan. The third possibility is a variation on the second. It holds that the value of an oyster's pleasure is always such that some further increase in well-being is available to it without end. But the amount by which it can be increased keeps diminishing. It approaches but never reaches a limit, and therefore it can never exceed that limit. With human beings, it is different. If the marginal value of human goods diminishes, the rate or onset of diminution is such that a normal human life filled with the elements of well-being is better than the life of McTaggart's oyster. And the fourth possibility is the one that I have said has some basis in ancient ethics. Goods are not all at the same level. In particular, virtue or virtuous activity belongs to a higher order than others. What this talk of levels or orders amounts to is this. For a good to belong to a higher order is for it to be the case that a sufficient amount of it is better than any amount of a good of a lower order. They are incommensurable in that there is no common coin or measure applicable to the two orders that would tell us how many more goods belonging to the lower order are needed for them taken together to be superior to a smaller quantity of goods of the higher order. Analogously, a student who writes many C papers is still inferior as a student to one who writes a smaller number of A papers. It does not matter how many more papers he writes. Similarly, for Aristotle, an active life of virtue for a complete period of time is a better life than that of McTaggart's oyster, no matter how long the oyster feels pleasure. Well, it might be thought that this fourth alternative is a non-starter. Someone who is skeptical about it might ask, well, what could explain why the superiority of the oyster's life with respect to the quantity of the pleasure it contains does not make it, on balance, the better life? However little pleasure is worth, enough of it accumulated over time ought to outweigh the value of all other human goods, given their limited duration. My reply is that no explanation is needed. Our experience of different goods is such that we correctly judge that a sufficient amount of one is better than the possession of the other for no matter what length of time. We know that judgment to be correct because it is grounded in our experience. That justifies us in believing this to be the case, even if we have no explanation of its truth. Our experience has made it self-evident to us. This fourth approach is the one that I favor for precisely that reason. My experience of some of the great goods of human life is such that I judge it to be superior to the life of McTaggart's oyster. I know what a mildly pleasant gustatory sensation is like. No matter how many days it is felt, and even if it never stops being pleasant and its value remains undiminished, a life that contains only that single kind of bland experience is inferior to a human life filled with the best of what we can experience, even if our lives have many fewer years than the thousands over which McTaggart's oyster endures. Next section, the richness of human experience, which gives the title for today's lecture. I will temporarily set aside the three other approaches to McTaggart's oyster. I'm going to come back to them in order to elaborate on the superiority of experientialism over hedonism. Pleasure is only one part of our conscious internal lives, and is not the only kind of phenomenal quality it is good for someone to experience. Within the realm of experience, the aspect of life that is available in the experience machine, pleasure is only one small part of a proper account of what is good for us. We can see that hedonism is mistaken every time we listen to an orchestra or have any other complex sensory experience. It is to a large extent the quality of the sound, not the alleged qualitative aspect of the pleasure, that makes us count this as a good experience. When we are excited because we are about to hear a new orchestra whose unique sound we have read about, we would be deeply disappointed if someone were somehow able to induce in us the pleasure of the experience minus its auditory quality. Even if we suppose that pleasure must be an ingredient of any experience that is good for us to have, a supposition I think is open to question, it would not follow that it is the only or even the most important ingredient that makes it good. That would be like saying that because the main item on one's dinner menu should always contain one or more spices, it is those spices alone that makes one's meal good to taste. All of the different taste sensations we experience simultaneously join together in making a good tasting dinner. In the same way, it is the integrated complexity of the experiential life of a human being, its unification of so many phenomenological components besides pleasure, blending together and modifying each other, that makes it better than an oyster's simple consciousness. Adding depth to our experience of life is our sense of the present as just one temporal portion of an experience that extends backward to the past and forward to the future. At each brief moment spent listening to music, for example, we bring to bear on our present experience our memory of what has preceded it and an anticipation of what is to come. The same point applies outside the aesthetic realm. Memories and expectations color our encounter with what we experience in the now. In addition to perceptual awareness, the world of colors, sounds, smells, and tastes, there is also a phenomenal quality to our active cognitive life. We are conscious of making judgments and conjectures, entertaining possibilities, searching through our memory, venturing predictions, encountering intellectual surprises, and the like. Conative phenomenology is no less varied, including our awareness of wanting, choosing, planning, wishing, hoping, and so on. A further phenomenological category includes the emotions, being happy, glad, proud, excited, feeling affection, love, admiration, respect, and lust. Imagine someone standing in front of a painting that he finds visually stunning. All sorts of thoughts are going through his mind. So I'm now singling out all the different aspects of our phenomenology in this one kind of experience. All sorts of thoughts are going through his mind. He is intrigued by what the figures in the painting are doing. Many subtle emotions are called forth by the narrative significance of the painting's subject. He decides to linger and to look at it from different angles. His eyes take in contrasts of colors and shapes. He is uncertain whether he fully understands what the artist intended, and continues to explore the painting's meaning and the reason for its emotional impact. So there's a lot going on here. This is a good experience for anyone to have, not because of something it later brings about, but simply in virtue of what occurs when it is going on. Pleasure may be part of what our viewer experiences, but he is, of course, also aware of the painting in front of him and his variegated responses to it. The goodness of this experience for him supervenes on all of the many aspects of his consciousness, not simply on the fact that he is feeling pleasure. Next section is experientialism. So I think experientialism is a better theory of well-being than hedonism. But why suppose that the components are all experiential? My reply is that non-experiential states are vulnerable to the point Aristotle makes against the view that well-being consists in virtue. If a virtuous person is asleep, he does not lose that good, he's still a virtuous person. But if he continues to sleep for the rest of his life, he's not well off. That's not a good life. I would go farther. I don't see any value in virtue if it is never active and involves no conscious thoughts, feelings, or desires. The same objection can be made to the claim that knowledge, love, and accomplishment are among the components of well-being. You can have those goods and sleep away the rest of your life. It would be better to say that intellectual exploration, that active conscious process, feelings of loving and being loved, and a sense of accomplishment make a life go well. For these are experiences. One has at best a small share of them when one is asleep. Well, that by itself is certainly not a complete defense of experientialism. One standard objection to it is that if your friends betray you behind your back, that by itself is bad for you, even if you forever remain unaware of their betrayal, and it has no bad consequences for you. A second standard objection is that we can be benefited or harmed posthumously. And a third is Nozick's experience machine. And I'll address that third objection in my second lecture. I will come back very briefly to the earlier of those two, but the experience machine will be my focus in the second lecture. A different sort of complaint is that I have not yet done what any account of well-being ought to do. It must say which goods it contains. What is well-being? I have said what all of its components have in common. They are experiential. Presumably they are good experiences. But which are the good experiences? So far, I have not answered that question. Before I respond to this complaint, I should guard against a possible misinterpretation of what I'm saying. I do not claim that the best life for us would be one that contained nothing in the way of sadness, pain, frustration, anxiety, stress, and other so-called negative states of mind. On the contrary, I think that if they are properly integrated into a larger whole, they deepen and enhance our experience of life. Many of our best experiences involve overcoming difficulties, defeating obstacles, rising to challenges that we fear we may not be equal to. I can express this point either by saying that these negative experiences are depleted of their potential badness when they are integrated into a larger whole, or that the best lives are good wholes, some of whose parts are bad. For the sake of simplicity, I will continue to say that well-being consists in good experience. So I can now turn back to the question, well, which are the good experiences? My response is that I do not pretend to have a complete list, and that we should not assume that completeness is necessary or desirable. Suppose someone said, well-being consists only in reading good novels. Obviously, that won't do. It's far too narrow. But it is not a further defect that we have not been given a definitive and closed list of which novels are the good ones. After all, they keep on being written. What we would need is not a complete list, but some rough and ready standard for making aesthetic judgments and sufficient exposure to novels to evaluate their quality. Similarly, experientialism needs to say something about good experience, but that task is not neglected here. One of my aims, for example, is to discuss the good experiences that come with being a good person. I will not propose an exact number of types of experience that are good. That open-endedness might be a feature that a theory of well-being ought to have. When we judge that an experience we are having or have had is immeasurably rich and worth having for itself, as when we are absorbed in a great work of art or surrounded by great natural beauty, we have some basis for valuing this experience precisely because it is our experience and we know it from the inside. Similarly, if we judge that our relationship with our children is one of the best things in our lives, we are basing that assessment on what we have lived through. When we do philosophy, it is our fascination, wonder, puzzlement, and sense of depth that convinces us that philosophy is worthwhile. It can hardly be its ability to achieve definitive results. The goodness of these activities is not experience. Goodness is not an observational property. But our judgment that it is good is based on experience. It would nonetheless be misleading or worse to say that the test of a theory of well-being is simply experience. That would fail to acknowledge the role of theory construction and philosophical argument in finding and testing a theory of well-being. The power of a theory of well-being, to the extent that it has any, derives from its ability to explain what is good in a wide range of human lives by appealing to a small number of good-making features. Hedonism would be just such a theory if pleasure could satisfactorily explain all by itself what is valuable in art, child-rearing, philosophy, and so on, but it cannot. My conception of the experiences that are best for us also has a developmental component. Like Aristotle, I hold that the best things in life are most fully available to us not in childhood, but when our powers have fully matured. We should grow up for many reasons, and one of them is that better things are in store for us as grown-ups. That being so, it must be the case that we adults know something about what makes for a good childhood, what is good for an individual when he is a child, and not good only because it is preparation for later life. It must also be the case that we know what makes adulthood potentially a better period. We compare that early time of life with what comes after it, and we see that opportunities for well-being increase. A theory of well-being would be ignoring valuable data if it did not build on this common knowledge. When life is good for us, that is because the potentialities that gradually are realized through education and training, our cognitive, emotional, and social powers, are regularly exercised over the many years of adulthood as we engage in ethical activity and many other sorts of activity as well. And now I come to my final section, McTaggart Revisited. So I return now to McTaggart's oyster. If we believe it has a worse life than the best human life of normal length, what error or of omission or commission accounts for his arriving at a false conclusion? One possibility, as I said, is that McTaggart ought to have said that within the normal span of a human life, there can be a sufficient supply of goods superior to any amount of oyster-like pleasure. That applies to McTaggart's imaginary comparison, the notion of different orders of value, one immeasurably or incommensurably superior to the other. Well, someone who does not like that idea might urge instead a different strategy. Suppose we say instead that although the oyster's well-being always increases to some extent, additional increases become less and less valuable, approaching but never reaching a limit, and therefore never exceeding it. That might seem promising if we assume that it rests on the familiar phenomenon that certain activities pay diminishing rewards as they are repeated. If you have read Pride and Prejudice twice within the past year, you will find a third reading less rewarding, and a fourth still less so, and so on. Perhaps there is no point at which you will have exhausted the riches of this novel. But even so, the value of each additional reading over the course of a year will diminish. But this example does not serve the purpose for which it is intended. Its plausibility rests on the assumption that with each further reading, there is less to learn and enjoy. The quantities of these goods diminishes, and that is why it is less good to have them. But what needs to be shown is that even when there is no decline in the quantity of an element of well-being, the value of having it keeps diminishing over time. So suppose we alter the example. We are now to imagine that a second and a third reading of the novel gives us just as much pleasure and insight as the first. So to keep the example close to common experience, we can imagine that one first reads the novel in one's 20s, and again a decade later, and so on, 30s, 40s, and so on. With each new reading, let us suppose one recalls nothing from one's previous encounter. That is why one enjoys it and learns from it just as much as one did in one's first reading. There would, in this case, be no diminution in the value of reading it again. It would not be a good reason against rereading it a decade later that one had already read it several times before. If one had to choose between reading it again and a worse book one had not read before, it would be a mistake to avoid Pride and Prejudice merely because one had read it before. What difference could that make if a further reading would be exactly as thrilling and eye-opening as one's first encounter? I propose then that we accept it as an a priori truth about well-being that its value does not diminish over time. It would be odd to suppose that our lives can go well for a certain number of years and then begin to go less well simply because we have already had good lives for all those years. No doubt it is a familiar phenomenon that such goods as health, vitality, strength, mental acuity decrease when one becomes very aged. And because these are the resources we draw on to lead good lives, well-being also diminishes. But well-being does not diminish simply because one has already had it for so many years. Since this a priori truth holds of well-being, it must also apply to its components. There is, as I have said, a rather different way of diagnosing McTaggart's error. We could deny that the pleasure it feels one day and the pleasure it feels the next day are to be aggregated because the oyster itself has no sense of time. To see what goes wrong here, let's imagine that the oyster has the ability to react differentially to its environment according to what it has encountered in the past. It returns to parts of the environment where it has found food for at least 2 days of the last 3, and does not return to less resource-rich and pleasure-giving locales. Well, that oyster is better off than it would be if it lacked that information storage capacity. Well, in making that judgment, we aggregate. We put together what it experienced one day with what it experienced on a different day, and arrive at a retrospective overall judgment of its total well-being to date. Whether any oyster has this functional equivalent of memory does not matter. It would remain the case that it would be good for an oyster to have this capacity, and that subjunctive conditional shows that we aggregate when we assess the good in an oyster's life. We must therefore agree with McTaggart to this extent. The best life for an oyster would be a long one. The longer the better. What he ought to have said, however, is that, be it ever so long, its goods would belong to a lower order. No quantity of them would be better than a sufficient quantity of the best of human goods. In conclusion, then, two questions remain for tomorrow. First, if there is a phenomenology of moral life, could it be such as to constitute a higher order good? I will not defend the thesis of ancient ethics that the ethical virtues are necessary ingredients of well-being, but I will try to show that they are sufficient ingredients. The moral life can, all by itself, constitute a good life. And the second question I will address is whether we should accept the famous critique of experientialism offered by Nozick's thought experiment, and I will explain why we should not. So the right way, and I think the only persuasive way to recognize the prudential value of ethical virtue is to assess it in experiential terms. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to entertain. You want to just,
So we'll take questions.
yeah. Great. So should I stay here? Okay.
You have a mic. You have two mics. Other people can hear them.
Thank you. I was wondering what you think about the commensurability of different kinds of goods within a human life. So the first question is, like, do we actually have access within our experience to the kinds of goods available to the oyster? And if so, is it ever rational for us to trade small quantities of distinctively human goods for very large quantities of oyster-like goods?
No, I don't think it is. So I think, you can, there's room for the question, how do you really know how an oyster... Yes, is this... Okay. There's certainly room for that skeptical question. How do we have any idea what the experience of an oyster is? And it may be that you are pressing me on that issue. And obviously, to begin with, we can't become oysters to find out. But what I'm basing my comparison on is that, well, the oyster's taste sensation must not be utterly different. It wouldn't be like human smell. It wouldn't be like other sensory modes. We have some idea of what the tastes of things is like, and it's getting some taste sensations. And so we can use our experience, our exposure to those experiences to, as it were, put ourselves in its shoes and have some conception of what its life is like, unlike the famous example that Nagel uses of what it's like to be a bat. I feel like I do have some idea of what it would be like to be a creature that only has something like the taste of white bread or something like that. So then your next question is, so within a human life, if my view is correct, that there are different orders of goodness, then of course that would apply within human life. And so it would be better for us not to give up a sufficient amount of something that is the better good for any quantity of the lower good. So that's what I'm committed to. Do you want to?
Sorry, could you just specify, so what do you mean by giving up a sufficient amount of the...
Just
Just wondering, sort of, if we're comparing not so much the value of two different complete lives as of quantities of goods within a life.
Right. So we do make trade-offs all the time. We give up certain things in order to have certain other things later. And that's perfectly rational, and it increases our overall well-being. So the question can easily arise, should I give up philosophy, music, friendship? Why would I do that? Because someone is offering me an oyster-like existence for a very long period of time. What should I do? And my view is, well, the fact that those pleasures endure for an extremely long time does not make the case that you should do this trade-off. And that's because we should not assume that all goods are exchangeable at some rate.
So my real question, I'll save for the next lecture, because I
Okay.
think you got the easy part today. But still, I'm
wasn't
not.
that easy?
But still, I'm not quite sure. I understand your notion of well-being, because it would not have occurred to me to think that well-being is only experiential, where you mean by that phenomenological. I mean, so my ability to do certain things, right? Whatever the experience, like, so something that gives me the possibility of, like, achieving an education, whatever it would be like to achieve an education. It's not because of what it's like, it's because of the change in my objective possibilities. So I have no intuition that all the elements of well-being are experiential. It's surely some of them are. Who wants to be in pain? Who wants to feel denigrated? I mean, there's all kinds of, like, I want respect from the other and all that. But there's objective things that I want to be able to do and contribute to. And I mean, when we esteem a life, we just don't esteem it for its experiential character.
Right.
So
Well,
make me feel.
I mean, one thing that may be feeding your puzzlement is that, of course, we want to. We have other things in mind besides our own well-being. We want to get an education so that we can contribute to the good of the world, and that's certainly not our own experience. We're trying to have an effect beyond ourselves. And so my response is that's quite true, but we want many other things besides our own well-being. So suppose I acquired an education and had a very sophisticated mind, which could serve some useful social purpose, but I would never be aware of using it. I would go back to Aristotle's example of the person who acquires some good but is in a good state and never activates that. Even if that could somehow be good for others, that would be a very serious drawback in that life. And so I'm taking the starker position. There would be no good in simply being in that state if there was nothing one experienced through it.
But that doesn't show that all goods are experiential. I mean, that just doesn't follow. Look, I love, esteem, value my son. I value more than just the experience of being his father. I value him. And that's the valuing him is not just an experiential thing. It's an attitudinal, it's a complicated thing.
Yeah.
So I just don't see, sure, experiential goods are among the goods, but that's not what you said, that experiential goods are among the goods. You said all elements of all the goods that go into a well-being are experiential. That's the part I don't get.
So your example now is valuing an individual like a son.
Right.
So there is this good for you, is the question that I want to ask. Your son may be a wonderful person and fully, may be completely appropriate for you to love him, to want to be with him, to admire him, and so on. What in this makes it something that is good, a prudential good? One obvious thing is there's the experiences that one has when one loves. So my question then is, well, what else? And I don't think there's a very obvious correct answer.
Can I just add one quick?
Yeah.
So here's one thing that intact human cognizing agents do. They value themselves. They value their lives. But my valuing my life isn't just liking my life in a sort of experiential way. It's taking my life to be a thing worth living. Now, I might value my son because I value the life I live by valuing my son. That doesn't make it, it doesn't make it experiential. Unless you want, maybe you have a kind of Laurie Paul type view where she thinks all valuing is experiential. But I just think that's
no. I don't claim that valuing is experiential. I claim that well-being has as its components only experiential things.
Okay. Well, anyway,
Yeah,
I don't get the
so,
only, but
yeah.
that's all right.
I have a question about the second quote on the quote sheet from Book 1, Chapter 5 of the Nicomachean Ethics. You've been using the first example throughout your talk pretty frequently, that of the person who is asleep and thus can't experience, and why that wouldn't be a good human life. But the other two examples seem somewhat less obvious, that the person there wouldn't be able to experience a good life or even a moral life, particularly in the instance of someone who has suffered the greatest evils and misfortune, for instance. It seems like someone could live a moral life and have experience of many cognitive states, emotions, those sort of things that are positive, but nonetheless for Aristotle wouldn't be living a happy life of well-being.
Right. So I agree with what you said. Aristotle is not claiming that virtue or virtuous activity is the only thing to be considered in assessing whether or not someone has a good life. And I agree with him. If one is unfortunate and is the victim of, if others are inflicting suffering on you, Aristotle is quite correct to say that detracts from the quality of your life. So don't take me to be saying that I'm going to defend the thesis that virtue is the only component of well-being, or virtuous consciousness is the only component.
Thank you.
The experiences of the higher order that you gave were all kind of elitist ones. Art, fine orchestral music, great novels. What about people who do other things, like watch TV? Are they capable of a good life also?
It depends on whether that's an oyster-like pleasure. TV can be, there can be great art on a TV screen. But an answer that I'm more eager to emphasize is that this is what emerges when we realize that being a good person by itself it can make one's life good. The experiential component of the virtues is available to everyone. And that is what makes it very, I'm tempted to say unique, but I'll just say very unusual, because these other elements of well-being that I've used in my examples do require a special training that is not widely available. But socialization into ethical ideas is a very widespread human phenomenon. So the optimistic feature of this, of my theory, is that well-being is not confined to a small group of people. And Aristotle himself at one point says, this is a good theory because we would expect well-being to be something that any human being could achieve.
Okay, thanks, Richard. So I want to ask you a little more about experience. So a lot of the times, the experiences we think might be part of a good life anyway are shared.
Right.
And they're connected to shared activities. Having a conversation, dancing a tango, singing a duet. You can make up some more examples. Philosophizing, right? So there are these shared activities and it's natural to talk about shared experiences. Now, on the one hand, those look like the things we should be talking about and talking about experiences. On the other hand, they have conditions external to the other person, external to the person. So we're not engaged in a shared activity of doing philosophy, though I think we are, if your intention structure isn't appropriate, right? If the words are coming out in certain ways, but you're trying to manipulate me in certain ways, don't have the intentions appropriate to doing philosophy. And similarly with playing a basketball game or singing a duet. So it looks to me like a rich notion of experience will talk about shared experience, and shared experience will be tied to shared activities, and shared activities will have conditions on the role, as it were, on the minds of the other. And so I wonder if that's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm anticipating what you're going to say about Nozick, but but insofar as thesis B is true, I want to know, are these experiences, do they include what we commonly call shared experiences? And if they do, we're starting to get outside the person whose well-being we're talking about in a way that might be in tension with your view. So I just wonder what you think.
So, I have to think more about that. I think well-being is not a shared, I mean, you can, of course, we want, as I said, more than our own well-being. We want others to have this as well. But well-being isn't the sort of thing that, like a house that we own jointly. It's an individual notion. We have these are states of an individual.
Well, but so the idea of a shared experience, which is associated with a shared activity, which we would have thought would be kind of part of well-being, is engaging in certain kinds of shared activity.
Yeah.
We can't really say that on your view.
I
It's
think
part of my well-being
yeah.
that I'm, playing basketball with my friends. I mean,
of course, any theory has to be able to say we have shared experiences.
Yeah.
But of course, that can't mean that there's a group.
I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
Yes.
So, you and I are playing basketball. That's a shared experience.
Stay on mine.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Sorry. So you and I are playing basketball. We can call that a shared experience. What is it about doing this, if anything, that is good for me? And so my view would be look to all sorts of phenomenological things that are going on. My excitement at the game, my feeling of friendship combined with competitiveness with you, feeling my body getting good exercise, and so on and so on. These are the sorts of things I have in mind when I talk about experience. You are also having similar experiences. We're engaged in an activity together, so we can talk of these as shared experiences. But the way that word is used, it's common sense phrase that we ought to keep using, but what it amounts to is where what we're doing can only be understood as something that is governed by certain norms that we both accept.
I don't want to group mind.
Okay, yes, good.
And I don't want to group basketball player
Right.
with 4 arms and 4
Right.
legs and so on. But it's going to be a consequence of your view that my engaging in a shared activity won't be part of my well-being. My actually engaging in a shared activity, because my actually engaging in shared activity has conditions that the other has to satisfy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other person's experience won't be part of your well-being, but that's as it should be.
So maybe the experience that would illustrate, I think, what a number of people have pushed on you is the experience you're engaged in right here and right now, which is trying to convey your ideas to other people. Is it irrelevant to the goodness of that experience to you, whether we understand your experience, whether we understand what you said or not?
Whether you understand it.
Yes, whether I understood what you said.
It certainly counts towards the success of what I'm trying to achieve. So if you haven't I haven't made myself.
Your experience would be no worse if it turned out everybody here was deaf.
Right. Yes, I am committed to saying if I am under the illusion that you're all listening to me, and when you nod or go like that, there's some mental activity going on in you. And that's what I'm striving for. So my goal, I'm not here to talk to myself, or I'm here to, I hope you get something out of these lectures. And if you don't hear them, then you will get very little out of them. So
But you'll get exactly the same.
But I will get exactly the same. Yes, yes, right. Mm.
Hi. I have another question about who has access to well-being, given that it's experiential. So if I understand correctly, and all of the goods that comprise well-being are experiential and phenomenological, then that means if you have a diminished capacity for sensation or experience, then you have a diminished access to well-being. And so I'm just wondering what experientialism makes of disability.
Yes,
because
right.
it seems too easy to say that there is a point at which a person just doesn't have access to well-being.
Yes. So I think it's very difficult to say of anything that seems to be a component of well-being, without this component, you cannot have well-being, period. So if a person is blinded, that I think is a misfortune, because there is an aspect of experience that is not available to that person. There are lots and lots of other experiences that are still available, and may be certain aspects of experience or more aspects of experience, sensory and otherwise, that are more fully available as a result of having to depend on other sense modalities. So it does not seem to me that losing access to one component of well-being means that one is, on balance, worse off than other human beings, or even worse off than one would otherwise have been.
That makes sense. But then what happens in the limit cases where one loses access to the vast majority?
Yes. Well, of course, I'm going to say if one is in a state in which one can only enjoy oyster-like basic pleasures that is, the oyster has some degree of well-being, but it's greatly reduced. It's a lower order of goodness. So that would be a severe misfortune. But as long as some goods belonging to the higher order are available to them, they can make for as good a human life as any other human life can be.
And then how do we value those individuals? I mean, I'm so curious
Yeah.
about the implications. Like,
Yeah.
what then do we do with those individuals in our society?
Yes. Well, I think if someone is a human being, that counts for a great deal in the question of how that individual should be treated. I think all human beings are part of a family of reciprocating ethical beings. And so there's no one who is to be written off, even if they have less well-being available to them. There's a view that those who have less well-being available to them should get priority in our distribution of goods. So that's fully on the table, that they should get not only as much attention, but more attention in a certain way than others. So my answer is, I don't think any shocking conclusions would follow from distinguishing orders of goodness.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Gone on for a while. Clearly, plenty of interest. People are intrigued.